I need you to look at something that's going to completely change how you think about human history, and this is a stone block in Baalbek, Lebanon that you can actually go visit right now and touch with your own hands. And when you see the specifications of this thing, your brain is going to short-circuit trying to understand how it's even possible with any technology we know about. This single stone weighs 1,200 tons. And to put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of 3 fully loaded Boeing 747 jumbo jets stacked on top of each other. And somebody not only moved this massive piece of rock, but they carved it into a perfect rectangular shape and then lifted it 30 feet into the air and placed it so precisely that you cannot slide a piece of paper between where it connects to the other stones around it. Now here's where this gets absolutely insane, and why this should make every historian and archaeologist wake up in a cold sweat. Our most powerful cranes that exist today in 2024, with all of our modern hydraulics and engineering and computer-controlled systems, max out at around 1,000 tons, which means that right now with everything humanity has developed, we physically cannot lift this stone. We don't have the technology to move something that weighs 1,200 tons and position it with precision, yet somebody did exactly that 10,000 years ago. So the official story is that humans who hadn't even invented the wheel yet and were using copper tools that are softer than butter somehow quarried this stone and transported it and lifted it into position, using what they claim were wooden ramps and bronze chisels and rope made from plant fibers. And I'm supposed to just nod my head and accept that explanation without asking how that's even remotely physically possible, given what we know about materials and engineering and the laws of physics. What makes this even more mind-blowing is that there aren't just 1 or 2 of these impossible stones. There are 3 of them, called the trilithon, and they form the foundation of what looks like a massive temple structure. But here's the kicker that nobody wants to talk about. The temple that sits on top of these stones was built by the Romans 2,000 years ago, which means when the Romans showed up with all their advanced engineering knowledge and their conquest of half the known world, they found these stones already there waiting for them, already impossibly placed, already ancient beyond their ability to understand. Think about what that actually means for a second. The Romans who built aqueducts and roads and massive structures all over Europe couldn't figure out how to move these stones. They looked at this foundation and said, "We have no idea how to replicate this, so we're just going to build our temple on top of it and hope nobody asks too many questions about who put it there in the first place." If the Romans with their sophisticated engineering couldn't move these blocks, and we today with cranes and hydraulics and computer modeling can't move them either, then who in the world placed them there to begin with? And more importantly, what kind of technology did they possess that we've somehow lost or never fully developed? And that's just the beginning of this rabbit hole, because once you start pulling on this thread, the entire fabric of human history starts to unravel in ways that are going to blow your mind. Now I want to ask you a question that's going to seem simple at first, but gets more and more disturbing the longer you think about it. And this is something that keeps me up at night, because nobody in mainstream archaeology has a good answer for it, even though it's probably the most obvious question you could possibly ask about human history. Where are all the bodies from 300,000 years of human existence? Because we're told that modern humans, Homo sapiens, people exactly like you and me with the same brain capacity and physical abilities, have been walking around on this planet for 300,000 years. And if that's true, then there should be bones everywhere. There should be so many ancient human remains that you couldn't dig a hole without hitting somebody's great-great-great-great-grandfather times 10,000 generations. So let me walk you through some really basic mathematics that anyone can verify, because numbers don't lie, and they don't have an agenda. If humans have existed for 300,000 years, and the average lifespan back then was around 30 years, which is actually being generous, because it was probably less than that, You're looking at 10,000 generations of people who lived and died and left their bones behind somewhere on this planet. Now, if we assume a really conservative global population of just 1 million people at any given time, which is less than the population of modern San Diego, that means over the course of 300,000 years, you would have 10,000 generations multiplied by 1 million people per generation, which equals 10 billion human beings who lived and died and should have left skeletal remains somewhere in the archaeological record. So we should be finding billions of skeletons, or at least hundreds of millions, or at the very minimum, tens of millions of ancient human remains scattered across Africa and Europe and Asia where we know early humans were living. But here's the thing that should make alarm bells go off in your head. We've actually found roughly 7,000 ancient human skeletons total from all the archaeological digs and excavations that have been done worldwide over the past 150 years. That's not 7,000 per country or 7,000 per continent. That's 7,000 total skeletons from supposedly 300,000 years of human history, which means we've found 0.0007% of the bodies that should exist, if the timeline is even remotely accurate. And that's not a small margin of error. That's being off by a factor of more than 1 million, which is so catastrophically wrong that it shouldn't even be in the realm of possibility. The standard explanation is that bones decay over time and don't preserve well, especially in tropical climates where most early humans lived. But we find dinosaur bones that are 65 million years old. We find trilobite fossils from 500 million years ago. We can find bacteria preserved in amber from 100 million years in the past. Yet somehow we can't find human skeletons from 50,000 years ago. And that doesn't make any logical sense when you actually think about the chemistry of fossilization and preservation. What's even stranger is that the skeletons we do find aren't evenly distributed across that 300,000-year timeline like you'd expect. Instead, they're heavily clustered in the last 6,000 to 10,000 years. It's like someone flipped a switch around 6000 BC, and suddenly there are humans everywhere leaving behind remains and artifacts and evidence of civilization. But before that point, it's almost complete archaeological silence with just a handful of fragments that don't tell us much of anything. And that pattern should be making everyone ask what really happened 6,000 years ago that changed everything. Let's talk about the Great Pyramid of Giza, because I want to walk you through the actual mathematics of building this thing. And when you see the numbers laid out in front of you, it's going to become immediately obvious that something is seriously wrong with the story we've been told about how this was constructed using primitive Bronze Age technology. The Great Pyramid contains 2.3 million individual stone blocks, and each one of these blocks weighs an average of 2.5 tons. With some of the larger blocks in the king's chamber weighing up to 70 tons each. And according to mainstream Egyptology, this entire massive structure was built in just 20 years during the reign of one pharaoh named Khufu. So, let's actually do the math on what that timeline would require in terms of work pace and see if it makes any physical sense. 20 years of construction time equals 7,300 days if you work every single day without taking any breaks for weather or illness or religious festivals or anything else. So if you need to place 2.3 million blocks in 7,300 days, that works out to 315 blocks per day. And if you're working a 10-hour shift, which is already pretty brutal, that means you need to place 31.5 blocks every single hour for 20 years straight. Now let me break that down even further so you can really understand what they're claiming was possible. 31 blocks per hour means you're placing one complete block every 2 minutes. And remember, these aren't little bricks we're talking about. Each one weighs 2.5 tons, which is 5,000 pounds. So every 2 minutes for 20 years, you need to quarry a 5,000-pound block of limestone from a quarry that's several miles away, shape it precisely so it fits perfectly with all the other blocks, transport it to the construction site, bring it up the side of a pyramid that eventually reaches 480 feet in height, and place it in exactly the right position with precision that we can barely match today with laser-guided equipment. The official explanation is that they used copper chisels and bronze tools to do all the cutting, even though copper is significantly softer than limestone, which is like saying you can cut through steel using a knife made of aluminum. And they claim they used wooden ramps to drag these multi-ton blocks up the side of the pyramid, even though there wasn't enough wood in all of Egypt to build a ramp system that could reach the top, and somehow they maintained this insane pace of one block every 2 minutes while also farming their fields and defending their borders and doing all the other things required to keep a civilization functioning. Here's what really gets me about the Great Pyramid. When archaeologists finally opened it up, they found absolutely no evidence that it was ever used as a tomb. There were no mummies inside, no burial chambers that had actually been used for burials. And weirdly, there were no hieroglyphics on any of the interior walls. Which is bizarre because the Egyptians put hieroglyphics on literally everything they built. Every temple and tomb and building has walls covered in their writing, except the pyramids, which are completely blank inside. We know for a fact that Egyptian pharaohs were buried in the Valley of the Kings, not in pyramids. We found their actual tombs with their mummies and treasures and detailed hieroglyphic inscriptions about their lives and reigns. So if the pyramids weren't tombs and the Egyptians didn't actually bury anyone in them, then what were they really for, and more importantly, who actually built them? Because maybe the Egyptians didn't build the pyramids at all. Maybe they just found these massive structures already standing there and claimed them as their own, and built their hieroglyphic decorations on the outside while having no idea what the interior was actually designed for. That would explain why we can't replicate the construction today, why the math doesn't add up, why there's no evidence of the ramp systems that would have been required, and why the Egyptians themselves left no detailed records of how the pyramids were built, which is strange because they documented everything else in excruciating detail, and it opens up a much more interesting and disturbing question about what was really going on in ancient Egypt and what they found when they settled in that region. I'm going to show you something from a place called Puma, Punku in Bolivia that's going to fundamentally challenge everything you think you know about the technological capabilities of ancient civilizations. And this isn't me speculating or theorizing. This is physical evidence that you can go look at right now. Stones that exist in museums and archaeological sites that demonstrate a level of precision that we supposedly didn't achieve until the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. Look at these stone blocks from Puma Punku. And I mean really look at the surfaces and the angles and the cuts, because what you're seeing is machine precision accuracy, with perfectly flat surfaces that are level to within 1/10 of a millimeter and 90-degree angles that are exact to a tolerance that would be impressive even in a modern machine shop. And these aren't soft stones like sandstone or limestone that you might be able to work with primitive tools. These are andesite and diorite, which are some of the hardest rocks on Earth. Harder than steel, harder than any copper or bronze tool that supposedly existed when these were made. The official story is that people carved these stones using harder rocks as hammers and sand as an abrasive. Basically, they claim that ancient people spent decades or maybe centuries on each block, slowly pounding away with stone on stone until they achieved these results. But here's the fundamental problem with that explanation. When you work stone with primitive tools, you get rough surfaces with visible tool marks and variations in the angles and imperfections that are inevitable when you're doing everything by hand. You don't get laser-cut precision that looks like it came out of a computer-controlled milling machine. We couldn't achieve this level of accuracy until we invented precision measuring instruments and mechanical cutting equipment in the 19th century. Before that, even the best stonemasons in the world working with the finest tools available could only get within maybe a few millimeters of true flat. And here we have stones from 15,000 years ago that are accurate to 1/10 of a millimeter with complex interlocking joints that would be difficult to design even with modern CAD software and computer modeling. What makes this even more impossible is that these blocks at Puma Punku are dated to around 15,000 years ago, which is 7,000 years before the Egyptians built the pyramids, and 9,000 years before Stonehenge. This is supposedly at the tail end of the last ice age, when humans were still living in small nomadic groups and just beginning to figure out basic agriculture. Yet somehow they had technology that wouldn't exist again for another 14,000 years until we developed industrial manufacturing. The mainstream explanation that they just spent an incredibly long time on each stone, using patience and primitive tools, doesn't explain the precision, because patience doesn't give you measurements accurate to 1/10 of a millimeter. Only machines do that. Only technology that we supposedly didn't possess until the modern era could create what we see at Puma Punku. And there's no gradual progression in the archaeological record. There's no evolution of technique from rough cuts to progressively finer cuts. It's just suddenly there, fully formed with maximum precision. So either we're missing huge chunks of technological history where ancient people developed and then completely lost advanced stone-cutting technology, or these stones were made by someone who had capabilities we don't understand and possibly can't replicate even today, or they were already here when humans arrived and we just found them and tried to figure out what they were for without ever understanding how they were actually manufactured. And that last possibility explains a lot more than the official story does when you really think about it. What's becoming clear is that there's a pattern across multiple sites around the world where the oldest layers show the highest level of technological sophistication, and then later, additions built on top are progressively more primitive, which is the opposite of what you'd expect if technology was advancing over time. It's like we're seeing evidence of a civilization that could do things we can't do, and then that knowledge was lost, and later people tried to copy it but never quite figured out how. In 1901, some Greek sponge divers were working off the coast of the island of Antikythera when they found a 2,000-year-old shipwreck, and when they brought up artifacts from this ancient Roman cargo ship, they discovered something that absolutely defies explanation and should not exist according to everything we understand about the technological timeline of human civilization. And this object sat in a museum for over 50 years before anyone realized what they were actually looking at. It's called the Antikythera mechanism, and when researchers finally X-rayed it and mapped out its internal structure, they found that it's a sophisticated mechanical computer made from bronze, with at least 37 precisely engineered interlocking gear wheels. And this device was designed to calculate and display astronomical information, including the positions of the sun and moon and planets, predict eclipses, and track various ancient Greek calendars. And the level of mechanical sophistication in this thing is absolutely staggering when you understand what would be required to design and build it. The gearwork includes differential gearing, which is the same technology used in modern car transmissions, where you need one input to drive two outputs at different speeds. And we didn't reinvent that technology until the 1600s. The gear teeth are cut with mathematically optimized profiles for smooth operation, which we didn't figure out until the Industrial Revolution, and the whole mechanism was housed in a wooden case with detailed bronze inscriptions explaining how to use it. So this wasn't some experimental prototype or one-off curiosity. This was a finished, manufactured product that someone built and other people knew how to operate. Now, think about what the ancient Greeks supposedly had in terms of technology. According to mainstream history, they had bronze and some early iron working. They understood geometry and had developed sophisticated mathematics. They could build temples and ships and basic mechanical devices like water screws, but they didn't have anything remotely close to the precision metalworking and gear-cutting technology that would be required to manufacture something like the Antikythera mechanism, and we have zero other examples of anything similar from that entire time period. It's like finding a laptop computer in a medieval monastery or a jet engine in an ancient Egyptian tomb. It's so far beyond what should exist at that point in history that it completely breaks our understanding of technological progression. And what's really crazy is that we didn't fully understand how this device worked or what all its functions were until 2006, when researchers used advanced X-ray computed tomography to see inside the corroded mechanism and map out every gear and dial and inscription. This means that for 1900 years after it was built, no one could figure out how to recreate it. There's no evidence of similar devices being made anywhere in the world for almost 2 millennia after this thing sank. And then, suddenly in the 1400s, we start seeing the first primitive mechanical clocks in Europe that are vastly simpler than the Antikythera mechanism. So we're supposed to believe that Greek inventors in the 1st century BC were so far ahead of their time that their technology wouldn't be matched again for 19 centuries. The standard academic explanation is that this was created by one brilliant inventor or a small group of craftsmen who figured out advanced gear work, and then the knowledge was lost when the Roman Empire fell and libraries were destroyed. But that doesn't really make sense because technological progress usually builds incrementally. You see simpler versions before complex ones. You see a progression of development. But with the Antikythera mechanism, there's nothing before it and nothing after it for centuries. It just appears fully formed and then vanishes. What if the Greeks didn't invent this device but found it or acquired it from somewhere else? What if they were reverse engineering technology from an older civilization that actually possessed the knowledge and tools to create precision mechanical instruments? What if this is evidence of a technological tradition that existed before the Greeks and Romans and somehow got lost or destroyed, and the Antikythera mechanism is just one surviving example of what that previous civilization could do, and that would explain why it's so far ahead of everything else from that era, and why there's no developmental history leading up to it. Here's something that should make everyone stop and seriously reconsider what we think we know about ancient history. And this is one of those facts that's so obvious once you see it that you can't believe mainstream academia just dismisses it as coincidence. Every single ancient civilization on Earth that left written records or oral traditions has detailed stories about a massive catastrophic flood that destroyed the world. And I'm not talking about a few cultures or most cultures. I mean, literally every major civilization from every continent tells essentially the same story. The Sumerians, who are the oldest civilization we have written records from, tell the story of Utnapishtim, who was warned about a coming flood sent by the gods and built a boat to survive it. The Babylonians have almost identical accounts with slightly different names. The Hebrew Bible has the story of Noah, which everyone knows. The ancient Greeks describe Deucalion's flood that wiped out humanity. The Hindus have Manu, who was warned by a fish avatar of Vishnu, and the Chinese have detailed accounts of the great flood of Gunyu that reshaped their entire landscape and required massive engineering projects to control the waters. But it's not just the old world civilizations. The Mayans have extensive flood mythology. The Aztecs describe multiple floods that ended previous ages of humanity. The Inca traditions include catastrophic flooding. Aboriginal Australians have incredibly detailed stories about rising waters that drowned the coastal lands where their ancestors lived. Native American tribes from all over North and South America have flood traditions. Pacific Islanders describe the ocean swallowing their lands. African cultures have flood myths. We're literally talking about over 200 separate cultures, all describing the same type of catastrophic event. The mainstream explanation is that these are just primitive myths and legends, that ancient people saw local river flooding or seasonal monsoons and created dramatic stories to explain natural phenomena. But that explanation completely falls apart when you look at the specific details in these accounts, because they're not describing regular seasonal flooding or a river overflowing its banks. They're describing world-ending catastrophes where water covered the mountains, where almost everyone died except a small group of survivors, where the landscape itself was permanently transformed. And here's what really makes you think. We keep finding physical, geological evidence that supports the idea of massive, rapid flooding events. We find marine fossils on top of mountains at elevations of 15,000 feet or more. We find sediment layers that show rapid deposition from enormous volumes of water moving at high speeds. We find underwater ruins and structures off the coasts of almost every continent now submerged hundreds of feet below the surface, and we have evidence of rapid sea level changes that would have been absolutely catastrophic to any coastal populations. The geological record shows that something dramatic happened with water levels around 10 to 12,000 years ago. Sea levels rose by over 300 feet in a relatively short period of time, geologically speaking, and that would have drowned every coastal settlement and forced massive human migrations inland. And if you're an ancient human who survives an event like that, you're absolutely going to tell your children about it. You're going to make sure the story gets passed down so future generations understand what happened and can watch for warning signs. These aren't vague memories that got distorted over time. These are detailed accounts that remain remarkably consistent across cultures that had no contact with each other. They describe the same sequence of events, the same causes, the same aftermath. And when you have 200 independent sources all saying the same thing, that's not mythology. That's oral history. That's memory of real events that actually happened within human experience. So what if all these flood stories aren't myths or legends or primitive explanations for natural phenomena? What if they're accurate historical accounts of a real global catastrophic event that fundamentally changed the Earth and destroyed whatever civilization existed before? What if that flood is the dividing line between the old world that we don't remember and the new world where we appeared? And what if understanding what caused that flood is critical to understanding who we are and where we actually came from? Let me tell you about something that's bothered me ever since I started really digging into human evolution, because the standard story makes perfect sense on a superficial level. You've got gradual changes over millions of years, with one species slowly transforming into another through natural selection and adaptation. But when you actually look at the fossil record and examine the timeline and the physical evidence, there's a massive glaring problem that nobody in mainstream science wants to address, honestly. Homo erectus existed as a stable species for almost 2 million years across Africa and Asia and parts of Europe. And when you look at their fossil remains from the beginning of that period versus the end, there's almost no change. They had the same basic skull structure, the same brain size, around 900 cubic centimeters. They made the same style of stone tools. They had the same body proportions. It's like they hit an evolutionary equilibrium and just stayed there for 2 million years, which is actually not that unusual in the fossil record. Then suddenly, and I mean suddenly in geological and evolutionary terms, you get Homo sapiens appearing in the record. And we are fundamentally different from Homo erectus in almost every meaningful way. We've got brains that are 50% larger at around 1,350 cubic centimeters. We've got completely different skull architecture with higher foreheads and reduced brow ridges. We have the physical capacity for complex language with specialized vocal anatomy. We demonstrate abstract thinking and symbolic reasoning and long-term planning. We make sophisticated composite tools. We create representational art. We have burial rituals that suggest religious or spiritual beliefs. Now, according to evolutionary theory, this kind of dramatic change should happen gradually over long periods with transitional forms, showing progressive changes from the ancestral species to the descendant species. You should see intermediate fossils with slightly larger brains, somewhat more advanced tools, progressive changes in skull shape, a clear developmental pathway from point A to point B to point C. But that's not what we find in the fossil record. What we find is Homo erectus, stable and unchanged for 2 million years, and then boom, Homo sapiens appears essentially fully formed with all these dramatic differences and no clear transitional stages. The standard explanation from evolutionary biologists is that we just haven't found the transitional fossils yet, that they existed, but we haven't dug in the right places, or the fossils didn't preserve well, or we're missing key sites. But we've been actively searching for these transitional forms for over 150 years, with increasingly sophisticated techniques and massive international efforts. We've excavated thousands of sites across Africa and the Middle East and Europe. We've developed new dating methods and fossil extraction techniques, and we're still not finding the smooth progression that the theory predicts. What's even more puzzling is that a 50% increase in brain size is not a small incremental change. That's a massive transformation that would require coordinated changes in multiple systems. You need larger skull capacity, which means changes to the entire skull structure and birth canal dimensions. You need different infant development patterns, because bigger brains require longer childhood development. You need significantly increased caloric intake to support the metabolically expensive brain tissue. And somehow, all of these complex interrelated changes happen simultaneously or in very rapid succession without leaving clear evidence in the fossil record. So you have to start asking whether the standard evolutionary model actually explains what we're seeing, or whether something else happened that we're not considering because we're locked into a particular theoretical framework. What if Homo sapiens didn't gradually evolve from Homo erectus through natural selection over hundreds of thousands of years? What if we appeared more suddenly? What if we're talking about arrival rather than evolution? What if modern humans showed up in a world that was already populated by other hominids like Homo erectus and Neanderthals, and we didn't evolve from them but coexisted with them? That would explain the lack of transitional fossils. It would explain the sudden appearance of fully modern human characteristics. It would explain why we see this pattern repeatedly in the fossil record, where species remain stable for long periods and then new species appear relatively suddenly, and it opens up much more interesting questions about where modern humans actually came from and why we're so different from everything that came before us. And I know that sounds controversial, but it fits the physical evidence better than pretending we have transitional fossils that we don't actually have. Now I want to talk about something that's going to make you question who controls the historical narrative and what they're choosing to show us versus what they're choosing to hide, because there are artifacts and discoveries that don't fit the official timeline of human history. And when these things get found, they have this really disturbing tendency to disappear from museum collections, or get dismissed as hoaxes without proper investigation, or just vanish from the archaeological record entirely, with no adequate explanation. Throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s, there were repeated newspaper reports from all over America about discoveries of giant human skeletons. And I'm not talking about people who were 6'6" or 7 feet tall. I'm talking about skeletal remains of humans who were 8 feet, 9 feet, even 10 feet tall. And these weren't just sensationalist tabloid stories. These were documented discoveries reported in credible newspapers and often made by county officials or scientists or during official archaeological excavations. The Smithsonian Institution, which is America's premier museum and research facility, reportedly received many of these giant skeletons. There are shipping records and correspondence and official documents showing that these remains were sent there for study and preservation. But if you ask the Smithsonian today about these giant skeletons, they claim no such records exist. They say they never received any giant remains. They suggest the newspaper reports were all hoaxes or exaggerations or misidentifications, but that doesn't explain why dozens of independent newspapers across multiple states would all fabricate the same type of story over a period of decades. And it's not just giant skeletons. There are well-documented cases of artifacts being found inside solid coal seams that are supposedly 300 million years old. things like metal tools and manufactured objects, and human-made items that absolutely should not exist in Carboniferous period coal deposits. And when these things are discovered, they get cataloged and photographed and sent to museums, and then they just disappear. They're not on display. They're not in storage inventories. They're not available for researchers to examine. They're just gone with no explanation. There's a famous site in Texas where human footprints and dinosaur tracks were found together in the same layer of limestone that's supposedly 110 million years old. And mainstream paleontology dismisses these as either natural formations that look like footprints or as elaborate hoaxes. But there are photographs and plaster casts and geological surveys from reputable researchers who documented these tracks before they were dismissed, and the explanations for why they can't be real keep changing every time someone addresses the evidence. What really bothers me about all of this is the pattern of how these anomalous discoveries are handled. If these things are really just hoaxes or misidentifications, then the proper scientific response would be to study them carefully, document why they're wrong, publish detailed analyses showing the evidence that they're not what they appear to be, make them available for other researchers to examine and verify the conclusions. But that's not what happens. What actually happens is they get dismissed very quickly without thorough investigation, and then they disappear, and anyone who asks about them gets labeled as a conspiracy theorist or pseudoscientist. I'm not saying that every weird artifact that gets discovered is necessarily proof of anything. I'm sure some of them are hoaxes and some are misidentifications and some are mistakes. But when you see a consistent pattern over more than a century of discoveries that challenge the official historical narrative all getting dismissed or hidden or vanishing without proper scientific investigation, you have to start wondering what else isn't being told to us. What else has been found and deliberately suppressed because it doesn't fit with what mainstream academia has decided history should be. The question isn't whether mistakes happen or whether some claims are false. The question is why there seems to be such a strong institutional resistance to investigating anything that doesn't fit the established timeline. Why are we not allowed to ask certain questions or examine certain evidence? Who benefits from maintaining one particular version of human history? And what would happen if we actually had access to all the artifacts and remains and discoveries that have been made over the past 150 years instead of just the ones that fit the approved narrative? So let me put this all together and show you what the actual physical evidence tells us when you stop trying to force it into the mainstream narrative and just follow where the data leads. Because if you look at the stones and the artifacts and the mathematics and the geological records and the flood traditions, you get a completely different picture of human history than what we're taught. Somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 years ago, something catastrophic happened to this planet. It could have been a massive flood from rapid ice sheet melting. It could have been a pole shift. It could have been an asteroid impact. But whatever it was, it fundamentally changed the face of the Earth, and the evidence for this event is everywhere once you know what to look for. Before this catastrophe, there was a world with a civilization that possessed technological capabilities we don't fully understand. They could move stones weighing over 1,000 tons, which we cannot do today. They could cut the hardest rocks with precision matching modern machine shop tolerances. They built structures using engineering principles we're still trying to figure out. And these were an primitive people. These were sophisticated builders with knowledge and tools that challenge everything we think we know. Then the catastrophe hit, and that entire world was destroyed so thoroughly that almost nothing survived except massive stone structures too big to be completely erased. Most of the knowledge was lost within a generation because when you're focused on survival, you don't preserve complex technical knowledge. And what remained were ruins scattered across the planet that no one understood anymore. Then humans appeared in this transformed landscape around 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, with almost nothing before that in the archaeological record. And whether we survived the catastrophe or arrived after it, we showed up in a world already full of ancient ruins, and we did what any intelligent species would do. We settled near the impressive structures. We built on top of megalithic foundations that were already there. We carved our symbols on walls that were already ancient when we found them. Over time, the memory faded, and new generations assumed their ancestors built these monuments because they were using them, and that became the foundation of recorded history because nobody alive remembered what came before or what was destroyed in the catastrophe that reset everything. This timeline explains everything that doesn't make sense. In the conventional model, it explains the impossible precision because it wasn't made with primitive tools. It explains why we don't find millions of ancient skeletons, because there weren't millions of ancient humans over hundreds of thousands of years. It explains why civilizations appeared overnight with writing and mathematics, because they inherited knowledge from ruins around them. It explains why every culture has flood traditions because the flood really happened and separated the old world from the new. The evidence is right there in stone all over the world, waiting for anyone willing to question the narrative and follow where it leads. So, if we really did appear recently in an already ancient world, if there was an advanced civilization before us that vanished in catastrophe, what does that mean for us living in the 21st century, and why should you care about alternative theories of history beyond just finding them intellectually interesting? It means we're not the first, and that should be both humbling and terrifying, because if others before us achieve sophistication, we're still trying to understand who built structures lasting thousands of years, while our buildings won't last a century. And if all that could be wiped out so completely that we barely remember them except through myths, then what does that say about our own civilization and whether we're prepared for history repeating itself? It means the experts don't have all the answers, no matter how confidently they speak or how prestigious their institutions are. They're working from incomplete information and often defending established narrative rather than investigating anomalies, which means you need to think critically about everything you're told and look at primary evidence yourself instead of just accepting what authorities say is true. It means physical evidence should matter more than academic consensus, because 1,000 PhDs agreeing something is impossible doesn't change the fact that it exists and you can touch it. The stones at Baalbek weigh 1,200 tons, whether academics can explain them or not. Reality doesn't care about our theories. Reality just is what it is. If there was a previous civilization that could do things we can't do, their knowledge isn't completely gone. It's preserved in structures they left behind, encoded in precision stonework, demonstrated in scale of their monuments. And maybe those structures aren't just buildings, but messages and warnings from people trying to tell us something important about what happened to them and what could happen to us. If they fell despite their technology, if catastrophe could destroy a civilization that mastered stone cutting and massive construction, then we need to ask what happened, because it could happen to us. And this time we have advantage of knowing it's possible, of understanding civilizations can fall completely, of recognizing what we've built isn't permanent unless we learn from mistakes of those before us. So what do you do with this information? Do you go back to normal life and forget it? Or do you start questioning everything you've been taught? Look at physical evidence yourself. Share this with others, because the more people who understand there's more to human history than school taught us, the harder it becomes to maintain official narrative and suppress inconvenient evidence. We appeared in a ready-made world. We found ruins we didn't build. We inherited knowledge and forgot where it came from. And evidence for this is carved in stone all over the planet, waiting for anyone willing to look with open eyes. The question is whether you're brave enough to follow evidence wherever it leads, even if it changes everything you thought you knew about who we are and where we came from.